Hello and welcome to another edition of Trans Talk. Today we've got a selection of filters here, and although filters you don't get to see them much, they are important. Just like an engine filter, they don't cost much, but they can cost you a lot if you don't change them often enough and have the right one in place. So I'm going to take a few minutes and show you the difference between some of the earlier ones, some of the later model filters that are out there, and I'll show you the difference between the good ones and not so good ones. Let's start with some of the early filters. On display here, we have a Turbo 400, some Ford filters, and actually a Turbo 350 filter. Now you'll see, you look close enough, these are actually screens. They're very fine mesh, this actually being a plastic mesh, and then the Turbo 400 is also a brass screen also. And sometimes these are actually referred to as screens rather than filters. But these filters are the early ones, and these transmissions, although precision instruments when they were built, don't require the filtering that the later models do. So that's why they use the screens. Some metal does actually go through the screen, but these transmissions do seem to tolerate that metal. Now we're going to move on to the later model filters, and you're going to see the difference in those. On these later filters, this being a 700 or 4L60E, this being the Ford AOD, these valve bodies don't tolerate the metal that the earlier models did. So they use a felt impregnated paper that is a very fine filtering media. As you can see, it's very similar on all these three. And that filters very well. But at times it may require more frequent changes. But these transmissions do require this type of filter. Why? The valve bodies in these don't tolerate the metal that the earlier ones did. The makeup of the valves within these valve bodies is not the same as the earlier models. Most of these are aluminum valve bodies, and the valves themselves may be aluminum with a high silicon base in them. So they do require the extra filters. And now with the electronic filters, with the electronic transmissions, you have to filter out the metal particles to keep the solenoids and the sensors clean within the transmission. So that's actually the difference between our early ones and our late ones. Now, in a moment, I'll show you the difference between the good filters and not so good filters. Now, the difference between the filters that are made with quality behind them and those that are not, I'll show you the difference. Now, the quality filters, most likely they will have a imprint of the company that makes the filter on the filter itself. As you can see here, it's very, very difficult to see, but there's an imprint of the company that makes that filter. If the filter does not have a name on it, it's probably an offshore and not such a good filter. Sometimes the mesh will not be as fine. That's another indication of a lesser grade filter. Sometimes you'll find the finish on these edges is not clean, or it's rough and it's frayed. Sometimes the filter element here will come out of this folded over metal. That's another sign of a filter that's not so good. Now, on these type of filters, on the felt type filters, again, look at the seams. See how well they're cut. They're folded over. Very nice seams. Again, here you're going to find identification as far as the company that makes it, and you're going to find original equipment or OE type of seals with those filters. You're not going to find cheaper filters. And again, here on this filter, high quality filters that we use, it is marked with the company and the origin of where it comes from. There are some offshore filters that are good, and in fact a lot are made offshore, and that's not the worst part. There are better grades and lesser grades of filters. Now you might think, when do we change them? Well, on some filters like the screen, you don't change those very often because actually they don't clog. A lot of metal still does go through those, but what I would recommend for any street rodder, depending on the mileage, if you're going to go 5,000 to 7,000 miles a year, it wouldn't hurt to change it once a year and change your fluid in the pan. On these felt type also, on the electronic ones, the same. You know, this is pretty cheap insurance. It does give you a chance to look inside the transmission when the pan is off and to see if there's any metal or any parts that may be starting to give you some trouble. Gasket wise, we have some on display here, and the black and the brown gasket here are far pack, what's called a far pack gasket. These are a hard compressed and sealed paper product. These are great when you have a very good aluminum pan and a good transmission gasket surface. These far pack gaskets are great. We use this most of the time. Sometimes you have to use a cork gasket like this, a cork composite gasket, because there's nothing else available on the market. These work great. They're a little less expensive. These don't seal that well against the chrome pans, and it wouldn't hurt to put a little high temp silicone sealer, just a little bit, on these cork gaskets. They'll seal a little better there. We discussed filters today. Our next trans talk is going to be about bushings and washers within the transmission. So stick around, and that's our next edition of Trans Talk.